Talk about this. Two terrific guests. Bill Richardson, former New Mexico governor, former U.S. ambassador to the UN. He successfully negotiated for the release of Americans held in North Korea. And our friend, the author, Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer and historian, Jon Meacham, also an MSNBC contributor. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. And Ambassador, I've wanted to have you on since this most recent crisis. We have Kim calling Trump yesterday a gangster, and not in a nice way, and we have Trump returning the insults as recently as a few hours ago. Where's this going to get us, and what's your fear about the inability to walk these back?
Well, this is a very frightening situation. The most heightened hostility between North Korea and the United States that I've ever seen. You know, I've negotiated with the North Koreans many times. I've been there 8 times. They take these personal attacks extremely seriously. Now, I'm not defending Kim Jong-un. I mean, he's acted irresponsibly with all these missile tests. But I remember in the past when his father was called a dwarf, but I think by President Bush. Recently, I was very mad at the North Koreans over their treatment of Otto Warmbier, who came back deceased, the treatment of him. And I said something like Kim Jong-un had acted like a brat. And I heard from the North Koreans. So I think this level of hostility, personal hostility, my worry is that it could backfire. I don't think Kim Jong-un is suicidal and he's going to attempt something drastic. But the worry I have is a miscalculation on their part. You know, a South Korean fishing boat getting shot at, or an overflight, an American plane. And there are other players there, Japan, South Korea, us, China. Somebody there's enormous political pressure on those leaders to do something, very tense situation. That's my worry. And my last worry is that it makes a path to diplomacy, to negotiations, to talks, which I think is the only way out of this impasse. Very difficult right now because of this personal animosity and these insults.
And Ambassador, is there any question we're just going to have to live with a nuclear North Korea?
Well, I don't think that should be our policy, but realistically, I think we have to start looking at freezing their missile activity, freezing their nuclear activity, finding ways that their ICBMs don't threaten the United States. That's going to require a negotiation. But the big problem, Brian, is we have no dialogue. We won't talk to the North Koreans unless they denuclearize. And the North Koreans say no. I think so the first step is just talking. Like, what do you want? What do I want? Like a meeting. And then you look short range at perhaps a potential freeze of the North Korean. They're going to want sanctions lifted, economic assistance. But I think it's the only way out of a very tense situation that affects American troops, American security, South Korean people, Japanese people, enormous tension in a very vital part of the world, and that's the Korean Peninsula.
So, Jon Meacham, as a man of history, there's a lot of history here. There's the Korean War, which never officially ended. There's the 38th parallel in the American families for whom it's indelible because their dads fought in that terrible, nasty U.S. effort. And there's also the pictures you and I grew up with from places I mentioned on the broadcast last night. The Bikini Atoll comes to mind, the nuclear tests over the Pacific Ocean, the terrific mushroom clouds. This was all new back then. Can you believe there's talk of an actual test over the water at the tip of an ICBM?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us thought on Christmas Day 1991 that this chapter had closed at the end of the Soviet Union. And now we're in a remarkable place. There's a certain historical symmetry. President Trump tonight was speaking from Huntsville, Alabama, which was a critical Cold War site in the American South. Extraordinary number of a good bit of our rocket technology, a good bit of our ballistic missiles came out of Huntsville, Alabama. And I think that one of the things that this crisis is going to have to show us, to go to the ambassador's point, is, as Henry Kissinger has said of the Middle East, is this a crisis that can be resolved, or is it simply a problem that has to be managed? And I think that in the 70-year life of the nuclear age, I think we've been remarkably fortunate that as few nations have managed to nuclearize. It's rising from year to year. But I do think we're in this very odd position where we have a nuclear threat in a regional conflict, which is an old pre-nuclear age question. That's what China's looking at. China doesn't want North Koreans rolling across their border. No. And I think the place to watch for whether this turns out well or not is perhaps less Washington and more Beijing.
John, a quick question, a serious question for people who have come upon this late. How is it that the only nation to have used nuclear weapons kind of tries to decide who can and cannot have them, and certainly tries to pass judgment on it?
We became the world's most significant superpower in the history of civilization, not to be too grand on a Friday evening, in August, you could say in July of '45, when the bomb worked. Robert Oppenheimer stood at Los Alamos and said, quoted the Hindu saying, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." To whom much is given, much is expected. Mm-hmm. And we've been given an enormous amount of power to end life. And I think that we by and large have lived up to that covenant, but it's a test every day.
We knew this topic and this segment were going to be weighty matters, and we could not have had two better gentlemen to talk about them. Thank you both so much on a Friday night in September for joining us. We would love to have you both back. Sadly, I know this topic is not going to go away. Bill Richardson, Jon Meacham, gentlemen, thank you. Another break for our